Welcome to Red Knot. I
Yay!
I'm Hushicho, and I'm here with,
Klebkatt.
and we are going to read a very, very dear story to me, to you, and it is called Cool Air by H.P. Lovecraft.
Yay, I guess I've never read any of this, so
Yes,
this is
this
new
is
to me.
this this is Caleb's introduction to Lovecraft, and I hope at one point we'll be able to read some of my big favorites like The Whisper in Darkness, which I think is my complete favorite of all of his work. But tonight I've chosen Cool Air because not only do I regard it very highly, but it's also a bit of a shorter work, so you won't uh, you won't have to stay with us for hours or anything like that. But you'll get a good feeling of what Lovecraft is about, and it's quite a gripping story. I also feel so.
Yeah, basically, I guess you could say the reason why I was asking to like try to keep it sort of more, Edgar Allan Poe, he wanted you to be able to read his stories in one sitting because he
Yeah,
felt if you stopped in the middle of it and went and did something, you lost the feel and the tension, the oomph of the story, and all that buildup was lost, and you kind of ruined it for yourself. Which is why his poems were and stories were kind of not necessarily short exactly, but not so long as you couldn't sit down for an hour or two and read them.
yeah. They never were like that vast novel length that takes you several sittings, or at
Yeah.
least it does me anymore. I read very quickly, but anymore I'm always so occupied doing something that involves writing
Yeah.
that when I'm not doing it, I don't want to read.
I'm
So
not I'm not a fast reader. I mean, anybody listening to me read out loud should know that I'm very slow and sometimes I pause. And I was always that kid in the class where I was almost done with my test or reading a short story or something we had to do in class that involved reading. And I'm like, I'm almost to the end, but everybody else is done. So the teacher's just like, okay, let's talk about the story, and I'm always like, but I'm not finished. I'm almost finished, but I like need about 5 more minutes. I'm that kind of person.
well, I think in some cases it's just because one wants to fully digest the work, and with words, as with art, there are a lot of people, and I am this way with art, with sequential art storytelling, especially like comics and things.
Hmm.
I can read it, but at the same time, I also want to pick out the details and in my mind analyze how something went down, how they cultivated their style and what they're trying to say to me through each panel. So I take forever to get through even comic books because I'll read it once very, very sort of casually, and then I'll read it to get the story, and then I'll read it again, to get the details and get the beautiful work and the environments around them. So
Well, for me, I don't think it's so much as in I want the all the detail and stuff. I think it's more of probably just how my mind works. I'm just slower to read, and it's a little more difficult for, me to read as fast as everybody else does. They can take it all in quicker than I can, and I have to go through one word at a time. And sometimes even that's difficult, but, you
yeah.
know, supposedly dyslexic and all that.
Well, and that can have a lot to do with it too, and it is a more monumental undertaking when you have that kind of a situation. So
Hmm. But so how did you want this read? Did you just want to read it all in one go, or should I? Or
well, let's
because
switch
I
back and forth.
because I'm kind of worried we might break the immersion of the story if we go back and forth. But
I
I
don't
don't
I
know.
don't think so.
You
As
wouldn't?
as long as you just tackle it straightforward, and of course I'm here if any of the phrasing is archaic or arcane. But if we each take a paragraph, we should be done with it in no time.
Okay.
But just don't be afraid of pressing on because most all of it is fairly straightforward. He has a very good command of the language, I think. So in that case, without further ado, Let us read cool air. You asked me to explain why I am afraid of a draught of cool air, why I shiver more than others upon entering a cold room, and seem nauseated and repelled when the chill of evening creeps through the heat of a mild autumn day. There are those who say I respond to cold as others do to a bad odor, and I am the last to deny the impression. What I will do is to relate the most horrible circumstance I ever encountered, and leave it to you to judge whether or not this forms a suitable explanation of my peculiarity.
It is a mistake to fancy that horror is associated inextricably with darkness, silence, and solitude. I found it in the glare of mid-afternoon, in the clangor of a metropolis, and in the teeming midst of a shabby and commonplace rooming house, with a prosaic landlady and two stalwart men by my side. In the spring of 1923, I had secured some dreary and unprofitable magazine work in the city of New York, and being unable to pay any substantial rent, began drifting from one cheap boarding establishment to another, in search of a room which might combine the qualities of decent cleanliness, endurable furnishings, and very reasonable price. It soon developed that I had only a choice between different evils, but after a time I came upon a house in West 14th Street which disgusted me much less than the others I had sampled.
The place was a 4-story mansion of brownstone, dating apparently from the and fitted with woodwork and marble whose stained and sullied splendor argued a descent from high levels of tasteful opulence. In the rooms, large and lofty, and decorated with impossible paper and ridiculously ornate stucco cornices, there lingered a depressing mustiness and a hint of obscure cookery, but the floors were clean, the linen tolerably regular, and the hot water not too often cold or turned off, so that I came to regard it at least as a bearable place to hibernate till one might really live again. The landlady, a slatternly, almost bearded Spanish woman named Herrero, did not annoy me with gossip or with criticisms of the late burning electric light in my third-floor front hall room, and my fellow lodgers were as quiet and uncommunicative as one might desire, being mostly Spaniards a little above the coarsest and crudest grade. Only the din of streetcars in the thoroughfare below proved a serious annoyance.
I had been there about 3 weeks when the first odd incident occurred. One evening at about 8 I heard a spattering on the floor, and became suddenly aware that I had been smelling the pungent odor of ammonia for some time. Looking about, I saw that the ceiling was wet and dripping, the soaking apparently proceeding from a corner on the side toward the street. Anxious to stop the matter of its source, I hastened to the basement to tell the landlady, and was assured by her that the trouble would quickly be set right.
"Dr. Munoz," she cried as she rushed upstairs ahead of me, "we have spilled his chemicals. He is to seek for doctor himself, seeker and seeker all the time, but he will not have no other for help. He is very queer in his sickness, smelling baths, and he cannot get excite or warm. All his own housework he do. His little room are full of bottles and machines, and he do not work as doctor. But he was great once. My father in Barcelona have hear of him, and only just now he fix an arm of the plumber that got hurt of sudden. He never go out, only on roof, and my boy Esteban he bring him his food and laundry and medicines and chemicals. My God, this sal ammoniac that man use for keep him cool."
Miss Herrero disappeared up the staircase to the 4th floor, and I returned to my room. The ammonia ceased to drip, and as I cleaned up what had spilled and opened the window for air, I heard the landlady's heavy footsteps above me. Dr. Muanzo I had never heard, save for certain sounds as of some gasoline-driven mechanism. Since his step was soft and gentle, I wondered for a moment what the strange affliction of this man might be, and whether his obstinate refusal of outside aid were not the result of a rather baseless eccentricity. There is, I reflected tritely, an infinite deal of pathos in the state of an eminent person who has come down in the world.
I might never have known Dr. Munoz, had it not been for the heart attack that suddenly seized me one forenoon as I sat writing in my room. Physicians had told me of the danger of those spells, and I knew there was no time to be lost. So remembering what the landlady had said about the invalid's help of the injured workman, I dragged myself upstairs and knocked feebly at the door above mine. My knock was answered in good English by a curious voice some distance to the right, asking my name and business. And these things being stated, there came an opening of the door next to the one I had sought.
A rush of cool air greeted me, and through the day was one of the hottest of late June. I shivered as I crossed the threshold into a large apartment whose rich and tasteful decoration surprised me in this nest of squalor and seediness. A folding couch now filled its diurnal roll of sofa, and the mahogany furniture, sumptuous hangings, old paintings, and mellow bookshelves all bespoke a gentleman's study rather than a boarding-house bedroom. I now saw that the hall room above mine, the till room of bottles and machines which Miss Herenro had mentioned, was merely the laboratory of the doctor, and that his main living quarters lay in the spacious adjoining room, whose convenient alcoves and large contiguous bathroom permitted him to hide all dressers and obtrusive utilitarian devices. Dr. Dr. Munoz. I'm having so much trouble. I'm so
sorry. We could always read something else if you prefer.
Well, it's just I keep tripping over words and stuff. Dr. What was his name?
Munoz.
Dr. Munoz most certainly was a man of birth, cultivation, and discrimination.
You're doing quite well, I say. I mean, for someone who has never read it, because sometimes Lovecraft can be very ponderous in some of his prose. He's very flowing, but sometimes it can be very dense. And I'd forgotten that there were so many of these words that were just like these massive words all in sequence. I think you're doing marvelously. The figure before me was short but exquisitely proportioned and clad in somewhat formal dress of perfect cut and fit. A high-bred face of masterful, though not arrogant, expression was adorned by a short iron-grey full beard, and an old-fashioned pince-nez shielded the full dark eyes and surmounted an aquiline nose, which gave a Moorish touch to the physiognomy, otherwise dominantly Celtiberian. Even though I've got it now.
One is the loneliest night that you'll ever see.
Thick, well-trimmed hair that argued the punctual calls of a barber was parted gracefully above a high forehead, and the whole picture was one of striking intelligence and superior blood and breeding.
Nevertheless, as I saw Dr. What's his name again?
Munoz.
I'm always going to forget that. I saw Dr. Munoz in that blast of cool air. I felt a repugnance which nothing in his aspect could justify. Only his lividity-inclined complexion and coldness of touch could have afforded a physical basis for this feeling. And even these things could have been excusable considering the man's own invalidism. It might too have been the singular cold that alienated me, for such chilliness was abnormal on so hot a day, and the abnormal always excites aversion, distrust, and fear.
But repugnance was soon forgotten in admiration, for the strange physician's extreme skill at once became manifest, despite the ice-coldness and shakiness of his bloodless-looking hands. He clearly understood my needs at a glance and ministered to them with a master's deftness. The while reassuring me in a finely modulated, though oddly hollow and timbreless voice, that he was the bitterest of sworn enemies to death, and sunk his fortune and lost all friends in a lifetime of bizarre experiment devoted to its bafflements and extirpation. Something of the benevolent fanatic seemed to reside in him, and he rambled on almost garrulously as he sounded my chest and mixed a suitable draught of drugs fetched from the smaller laboratory room. Evidently he found the society of a well-born man a rare novelty in this dingy environment, and was moved to unaccustomed speech as memories of better days surged over him.
His voice, if queer, was at least soothing, and I could not even perceive that he breathed as the fluent sentences rolled urbanely out. He sought to distract my mind from my own seizure by speaking of his theories and experiments, and I remember his tactfully consoling me about my weak heart by insisting that will and consciousness are stronger than organic life itself, so that if a bodily frame be but originally healthy and carefully preserved, it may, through a scientific enhancement of these qualities, retain a kind of nervous animation despite the most serious impairments, defects, or even absences in the battery of specific organs. He half jestingly said, some day teach me to live, or at least to possess some kind of conscious existence, without any heart at all. For his part, he was afflicted with a compilation of maladies requiring a very exact regimen, which included constant cold. Any marked rise in temperature might, if prolonged, affect him fatally, and the frigidity of his habitation, some 55 or 56 degrees Fahrenheit, was maintained by an absorption system of ammonia cooling, the gasoline engine of whose pumps I had often heard in my own room below.
Relieved of my seizure in a marvellously short while, I left the shivery place disciple and devotee of the gifted recluse. After that I paid him frequent overcoated calls, listening while he told of secret researches and almost ghastly results, and trembling a bit when I examined the unconventional and astonishingly ancient volumes on his shelves. I was eventually, I may add, almost cured of my disease for all time by his skillful ministrations. Shit. I forgot to turn the sound off. Let me read that again. Edit that part out. I forgot to turn the sound off my laptop.
I'm just gonna put a whole thing in there, be like, not cat dragon. What am I talking about? Wrong thing. I've been working on my comic, but it's still on my mind. Bad fan fiction theater and other stuff we've been reading. The bloopers. But anyway.
I was eventually, I may add, almost cured of my disease for all time by his skilful ministrations. It seemed that he did not scorn the incantations of the medievalists, since he believed these cryptic formulae to contain rare psychological stimuli which might conceivably have singular effects on the substance of a nervous system from which organic pulsations had fled. I was touched by his account of the aged Dr. Torres of Valencia, who had shared his earlier experiments with him through the great illness of 18 years before, whence his present disorders proceeded. No sooner had the venerable practitioner saved his colleague than he himself succumbed to the grim enemy he had fought. Perhaps the strain had been too great, for Dr. Munoz made it whisperingly clear, though not in detail, that the methods of healing had been most extraordinary, involving scenes and processes not welcome by elderly and conservative Gallens.
As the weeks passed, I observed with regret that my new friend was indeed slowly but unmistakably losing ground physically, as Miss Moreno had suggested. The livid aspect of his countenance was intensified, his voice became more hollow and indistinct, his muscular motions were less perfectly coordinated, and his mind and will displayed less resilience and initiative. Of this sad change he seemed by no means unaware, and little by little his expression and conversation both took on a gruesome irony, which restored in me something of the subtle repulsion I had originally felt.
He developed strange caprices, acquiring a fondness for exotic spices and Egyptian incense, till his room smelled like the vault of a sepulchred pharaoh in the Valley of Kings. At the same time his demands for cold air increased, and with my aid he amplified the ammonia piping of his room and modified the pumps and feed of his refrigerating machine till he could keep the temperature as low as 34 or 40 degrees, and finally even 28. The bathroom and laboratory, of course, being less chilled, in order that water might not freeze, and that chemical processes might not be impeded. The tenant adjoining him complained of the icy air from round the connecting door, so I helped him fit heavy hangings to obviate the difficulty. A kind of growing horror of outre and morbid casts seemed to possess him. He talked of death incessantly, but laughed hollowly when such things as banishment were gently suggested.
All in all, he became a disconcerting and even gruesome companion, yet in my gratitude for his healing I could not well abandon him to the strangers around him, and was careful to dust his room and attend to his needs each day, muffled in a heavy ulster which I brought especially for the purpose. I likewise did much of his shopping, and gasped in bafflement at some of the chemicals he ordered from druggists and laboratory supply houses.
An increasing and unexplained atmosphere of panic seemed to rise round his apartment. The whole house, as I have said, had a musty odour, but the smell in his room was worse, and in spite of all the spices and incense and the pungent chemicals and the now incessant baths which he insisted on taking unaided, I perceived that it must be connected with his ailment, and shuddered when I reflected on what that ailment might be. Mrs. Herrero crossed herself when she looked at him, and gave him up unreservedly to me, not even letting her son Esteban continue to run errands for him. When I suggested other physicians, the sufferer would fly into as much of a rage as he seemed to dare to entertain. He evidently feared the physical effect of violent emotion, yet his will and driving force waxed rather than waned, and he refused to be confined to his bed. The lassitude of his earlier ill days gave place to a return of his fiery purpose, so that he seemed about to hurl defiance at the death demon even as that ancient enemy seized him. The pretence of eating, always curiously like a formality with him, he virtually abandoned, and mental power alone appeared to keep him from total collapse.
He acquired a habit of writing long documents of some sort, which he carefully sealed and filled with injunctions that I transmit them after his death to certain persons whom he named, for the most part lettered East Indians, but including a once celebrated French physician now generally thought dead, and about whom the most inconceivable things had been whispered. As it happened, I burned all these papers undelivered and unopened. His aspect and voice became utterly frightful, and his presence almost unbearable. One September day an unexpected glimpse of him induced an epileptic fit in a man who had come to repair his electric desk lamp, a fit for which he prescribed effectively whilst keeping himself well out of sight. That man, oddly enough, had been through the terrors of the Great War without having incurred any fright so thorough.
Then, in the middle of October, the horror of horrors came with stupefying suddenness. One night about 11, the pump of the refrigerating machine broke down, so that within 3 hours the process of ammonia cooling became impossible. Dr. Munoz summoned me by thumping on the floor, and I worked desperately to repair the injury while my host cursed in a tone whose lifeless, rattling hollowness surpassed description. My amateur efforts, however, proved of no use, and when I had brought in a mechanic from a neighbouring all-night garage, we learned that nothing could be done till morning, when a new piston would have to be obtained. The moribund hermit's rage and fear, swelling to grotesque proportions, seemed likely to shatter what remained of his failing physique, and once a spasm caused him to clap his hands to his eyes and rush into the bathroom. He groped his way out with face tightly bandaged, and I never saw his eyes again.
The frigidity of the apartment was now sensibly diminishing, and at about 5 a.m. the doctor retired to the bathroom, commanding me to keep him supplied with all the ice I could obtain at all-night drugstores and cafeterias. As I would return from my sometimes discouraging trips and lay my spoils before the closed bathroom door, I could hear a restless splashing within, and a thick voice croaking out the order for more. At length a warm day broke, and the shops opened one by one. I asked Esteban either to help with the ice fetching whilst I obtained the pump piston, or to order the piston while I continued the ice, but instructed by his mother, he absolutely refused.
Finally, I hired a seedy-looking loafer whom I encountered on the corner of 8th Avenue to keep patients supplied with ice from a little shop where I introduced him, and applied myself diligently to the task of finding a pump piston and engaging workmen competent to install it. The task seemed interminable, and I raged almost as violently as the hermit when I saw the hours slipping by in a breathless, foodless round of vain telephoning, and a hectic quest from place to place, hither and thither by subway and surface car. About noon I encountered a suitable supply house far downtown, and approximately 1:30 p.m. arrived at my boarding place with the necessary paraphernalia and 2 sturdy and intelligent mechanics. I had done all I could and hoped I was in time.
Black terror, however, had preceded me. The house was in utter turmoil, and above the chatter of odd voices I heard a man praying in a deep basso. Fiendish things were in the air, and the lodgers told over the beads of their rosaries as they caught the odor from beneath the doctor's closed door. The longer I had hired, it seems, had fled. Wait. Oh, the lounger I had hired. Okay, I was confused for a minute.
It's all right.
The lounger I had hired, it seems, had fled screaming and mad-eyed not long after his second delivery of ice, perhaps as a result of excessive curiosity. He could not, of course, have locked the door behind him, yet it was now fastened, presumably from the inside. There was no sound within save a nameless sort of low, thick dripping.
Briefly consulting with Mrs. Herrero and the workmen, despite a fear that gnawed at my inmost soul, I advised the breaking down of the door, but the landlady found a way to turn the key from the outside with some wire device. We had previously opened the doors of all the other rooms on that hall, and flung all the windows to the very top. Now, noses protected by handkerchiefs, we tremblingly invaded the accursed south room, which blazed with the warm sun of early afternoon.
A kind of dark, slimy trail led from the open bathroom door to the hall door, and thence to the desk, where a terrible little pool had accumulated. Something was scrawled there in pencil in an awful blind hand on a piece of paper, hideously smeared as though by the very claws that traced the hurried last words. Then the trail led to the couch and ended unutterably.
What was or had been on the couch I cannot and dare not say here, But this is what I shiveringly puzzled out on the stickily smeared paper before I drew a match and burnt it to a crisp. What I puzzled out in terror as the landlady and two mechanics rushed frantically from that hellish place to babble in their incoherent stories at the nearest police station. The naughtiest words seemed well-nigh incredible in that yellow sunlight, with the clatter of cars and motor trucks ascending clamorously from crowded 14th Street. Yet I confess that I believed them then. Whether I believe them now, I honestly do not know. There are things about it which it is better not to speculate. And all that I can say is that I hate the smell of ammonia and grow faint at the draught of unusually cool air.
The end, ran that noisome scroll, is here. No more ice. The man looked and ran away, warmer every minute, and the tissues can't last. I fancy you know what I said about the will and the nerves and the perseverance of preserved body after the organs cease to work. It was good theory, but couldn't keep up indefinitely. There was a gradual deterioration I had not foreseen. Dr. Torres knew, but the shock killed him. He couldn't stand what he had to do. He had to get me in a strange, dark place when he minded my letter and nursed me back. And the organs never would work again. It had to be done my way, artificial preservation. For, you see, I died that time 18 years ago. Yay!
Yay! Oh, that was lovely.
As I trip over my sentences and words.
You did marvelously well. I didn't remember it being so complicated. But it's a really complicated story.
It was written back in the day when they used, like, big words, and people knew what those big words meant.
Yeah, but
and how to say them.
I mean, some of his stuff is just very straightforward and rather simple. And I had forgotten cool air being, in parts, so very dense. But I enjoyed that immensely, and you did such a wonderful job on it. Did you enjoy it?
It was okay.
It's not his most frightening work. It's more of like an unsettling, and it draws you in as it sort of gets more unsettling. And
well, I don't really know if to say I was unsettled. It was just like, okay, this is happening, followed by this. I wonder what's going on.
I think sometimes with some of his stories, it's best to read them once and then read them again and sort of let it unfold in your mind, because Cool Air, I feel like, is very subtle. Like the first time I read it, I didn't quite, I don't know, like it didn't impact me as it did subsequent times. And there was that episode of Night Gallery where they did a quite good, actually, adaptation of Cool Air. And I really think that it has a tremendously disturbing and unsettling tone to it, and the implications are extremely unsettling. But it is one of those things that just it has a sort of a steady unfold. So the first time one reads it, it doesn't quite stick, I feel like. And usually it's the second or third time where I've read Lovecraft's stories that it really gets to me, like it really hits me or gets under my skin.
I don't know. Maybe if I did read it again on my own, maybe it would have a little more impact, because now I've got past some of the more difficult words, and I at least have an idea of how the story progresses and the like. But you know, this was okay. This is probably a nice, not very horror-ish introduction to Lovecraft. If you're like myself and have never read anything Lovecraft, just heard about it.
I think it's very horror-ish, though. you don't. It doesn't really dawn on you explicitly what's happening until the very end. But then a lot of his stories like that. But I think it is a very horrific tale because you have this doctor who is a fantastic doctor and an amazing charismatic man, but there is something from the very beginning that is unsettling about him that puts people off him, and it's impossible to really figure out what that is at first for the narrator and even for the other people in the boarding house, and then as it gradually starts to unfold, there's a little bit more of the mystery and a little bit more of the mystery, and it turns out that he's only really alive through the cooling system and his force of will, which is rather, I don't know, it's rather chilling to me. Oh, I didn't mean it that way.
Don't worry, I've done that before.
I wasn't trying to make a pun, I swear.
I was watching somebody do a drawing of Mr. Freeze, and I said it without meaning to. I'm like, is that Mr. Freeze? Cool. And then somebody's like, aha, I see what you did there. And I'm like, what did I do there? I don't understand what you mean. They're like, Mr. Freeze, cool, haha, huh? I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. It's like put a saddle on them, run around like pigs. Like I just say stuff and I don't actually realize there's something wrong with what I just said.
Yeah, sometimes I make puns, and I have a couple of friends who are just way into puns, so they will just react as if I've said the most hilarious thing, the most brilliant thing. And I just sort of have to go on with it. And it usually doesn't occur to me until they start laughing that, oh yeah, I just totally made a pun. Time to pretend like I meant it. Time to pretend like I'm actually that clever.
So, basically, maybe this is one of those, depending on which story you read by Lovecraft, perhaps it's your mileage may vary kind of thing. I don't really see this all that horrifying, intriguing, and I see it more as like, well, that was a nice little read, and then move on to something else. Me personally, I'd say it's interesting, but it really wouldn't make me read other Lovecraft stories, in particular. But it's not like we do for bad fan fiction theater. It's nowhere nothing like that.
Well, really, Cool Air is an uncommon Lovecraft tale anyway, because most of his best known things deal in the horrors of the unknown or eldritch horrors and things like that. Cool Air is really horrific to me because of its accessibility. It is a very accessible, very down-to-earth tale that is made more believable by its common trappings, and one sort of starts to feel for the eccentric doctor who has helped the narrator through his seizure of whatever kind, but who ultimately realizes that he's unable to cheat death indefinitely. And in fact, it's a tragic flaw in him that piston. He had this machine to cool, but he didn't really have the backup parts just in case.
Yeah, I was going to say, you would think in case something happened, you would have spare parts.
Yeah, but that's also a tragic flaw, because in any tragedy, there's almost always something, like one thing.
Yeah. And even if you had spare parts, eventually it's going to go wrong and you can't fix it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was sort of an inevitable thing anyway, and almost probably a commentary on mortality itself. But for the guy to have basically, fallen apart, literally, practically melted, it's just, it is very horrific to me, because, he kept himself going for 18 years, and that was after he died. This other doctor had developed, this process, but it killed him of the realization that he had done this. that he had enabled Dr. Munoz to sort of defy death by will alone, plus these chemical baths and the cooling and
Yeah.
things like that. So, and obviously it traumatized the narrator enough that just the feel of cool air
Well, yeah, I
stirs.
mean, if that was say a real life situation thing that was going, yeah, that'd be horrifying to me to be in that moment. But me as just reading it, I'm not really horrified.
Well, you have to let
You
your
know.
mind go a bit too, though. I mean, you have to put yourself in the role of that person. But then I think a second reading will make it
Perhaps.
more accessible because just like you said, the language is very different. So it's not exactly the conversational language of today.
Yeah. I
And
mean, it's not
most,
like you couldn't follow it, but it is, much more, oh, I don't really want to say like educated type of speech, but, people don't really talk or write like that anymore. And so,
yeah,
you know, it's not like you don't know what most of those words mean. It's just strange to see them there and, just keep reading and going and act like it's, a normal everyday thing to see, um, a more, not exactly archaic, but an older style of
yeah.
writing, I suppose. So, that was really my feelings on it. Maybe I'd feel different if I reread it, which
I think
I'll
I
probably
think
give
you'll
a shot later.
yeah, I think you'll probably feel different rereading it because the first time to read something like that is a lot of it's really getting a feel
Mhm.
for his writing style and his particular voice as a writer. But honestly, I would say that if you're up for excuse me, got something in my throat. Uh, at some point, if you're up for it, you may want to read The Whisperer in Darkness,
Mhm.
because that is my absolute favorite of Lovecraft's stories, because I feel like it sort of epitomizes his style of horror, and it is extremely unsettling. I feel it's one of those things that is just it's very very unsettling in my opinion. Also, some of the stuff that he's done is more accessible, more entertaining in a video form. There was a silent film adaptation of The Call of Cthulhu that was just a few years ago. I think it was 2006 or so. Maybe it was after that. Maybe it was slightly before. But it's a really good silent film adaptation of The Call of Cthulhu, and it is superb. It is very close to the story, and it's just really, really well done. And the aforementioned episode of Night Gallery, which has the adaptation of Cool Air on it, is actually very good. It changes well, to be honest, the story doesn't really make clear if the narrator of Cool Air is male or female, but it is the character is female in the episode of Night Gallery, and it is a superb adaptation. It is actually really good. I think actually you might like the story more by seeing that
Yeah,
adaptation.
maybe. But I also, I wasn't really going to talk about this, but I also have an aversion to first person because I don't know if I've told you this, but I've told other people. It's like I would not do this stuff. I wouldn't go in there. I would leave. I just don't really care also for first person. Maybe that's the thing because I don't know. I never really cared for first person. But
Well,
I mean, that doesn't make it a bad story. It's just more of a taste thing.
I think I used to I present things, but at the same time, over the years, I sort of started to feel it is a it is a more direct, involving voice, and it's not supposed to be you, but it draws you in because you get to see from someone else's perspective, and that perspective is not just a visual one or a physical one. it also, in most good writings, will include the thought processes and the feelings of the person narrating it. So it brings one in when done well, but there are a lot of poor first person tales as well. It's tricky to do well,
Yeah.
especially if you you have a lot of things that happen that the narrator is not privy to, and then you either feature it and don't really have any reason to because, well, obviously the narrator cannot witness these things, or you just jump all over the place with different first person
Yeah.
accounts, which is very tricky, especially if they have a different voice, and most people do have a different voice than each other. So, but anyway, I recommend watching the episode of Night Gallery with Cool Air, and I also recommend reading The Whisper in Darkness. And we can read that on here sometime if you want to.
Okay.
But I think Lovecraft is a really good writer, but Cool Air is not one that I would say is his most terrifying. But over the years, I have cultivated a definite appreciation for it because I don't know. There's something romantic about it to me, and there's also something very deeply disturbing about it. But I think part of that may also be due to that same Night Gallery episode, because the Night Gallery adaptation of it was very, very good. Very, very good.
I think for me, I just have to read more technically horrifying things because this just doesn't really pull me in. Um, I mean, it's an interesting read, but it's not something I'd personally want to read again. I'd probably just float around and maybe read some other things by Lovecraft and see if that works. Which, maybe you guys who really like Lovecraft could leave some suggestions for some of the stories to read. Try to make sure. I don't know if he has anything multi-chaptered, but try to make sure it's something we could reasonably do in an hour or two.
Yeah, a lot of the stories are multi-chapter, and something like The Whisper in Darkness would probably take us a couple of hours to get through, but it is an excellent work. In fact, some of the stories that I would have liked to introduce him to you with would have taken so long for us to get through
Yeah.
it, and by the end I don't think you would have been as involved as if you had been able to just read it on your own.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in the case of Cool Air, it was a case of, okay, the story is short enough, it's good enough, and because like if you had read it on your own, you might not have even read it. If you'd
Yeah.
looked down the list, you may not have even clicked on Cool Air. But I it's one of the ones that I'm quite fond of. But I do think that there are better and more impactful tales, such as The Whisper in Darkness, which would probably be more amusing. And Pickman's Model, The Shadow over Innsmouth, is another good one. And of course, The Call of Cthulhu, which is the iconic
Yeah.
tale.
So, what kind of sign out do you have for this?
Um, well, I can't remember my Cthulhu cult chants, so I will just say thank you for tuning in, and hopefully we'll have some more fun and interesting tales to read for you. And I hope you will leave some suggestions so that Caleb here can get into and appreciate the world of H.P. Lovecraft, and
Or at least try to.
yeah, at least try to. I mean, everything's not for everyone.
Yeah,
But
I mean, I could still, appreciate the significance of the guy, and it's not like I absolutely hate it and think it's stupid. I'm just like, it's okay.
well, honestly, Cool Air compared to a lot of the other things, I can definitely say that for most people it would be on that okay level.
Mm.
Something like The Whisper in Darkness blows it out of the water, but it is actually so much longer that it would have been really prohibitive for us to try and read it in as short a time as we have. So, but I would unhesitantly recommend that in in your spare time if you want to read through it or something like that, because it is a genuinely very good story and very unsettling.
I feel like I should sign it out, but you've pretty much taken the lead on this, so.
Well, I gave the intro. Why don't you sign us out?
Okay. This has been Red Knot, and thank you for listening, guys. Bye.
Bye.